happy to introduce our candidates, Layla Moran and Ed Davey. Layla will go first for her opening statement.
Well, firstly, thank you so much, all of you, for coming, and everyone who's joining this hustings. It's an absolutely essential part of our leadership election, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to once again hear from Lib Dems across Europe, but indeed across the world. And for me, this discussion has a personal significance. My father was an EU diplomat. I grew up as a British citizen living in Belgium, Greece, Ethiopia, Jamaica, and Jordan. And my parents still live in Brussels, my brother in Paris, and my sister in Berlin. So I understand exactly what it means to be part of a community where you live, while at the same time keeping a strong connection to the UK and helping to shape its future. But it's not just personal. Liberal Democrats abroad is at the very heart of who we are as a party. Your experience, knowledge, and passion are a vital resource for us. We are proud internationalists, and our liberal values aren't constrained by artificial borders. This internationalism is integral to my three campaign themes of education, the environment, and the economy. We need to make our education system outward-looking, welcoming more students from around the world and giving our young people opportunities to study abroad. We need to work more closely with other countries to tackle the climate and nature emergencies, making our own society not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative by 2045. And we need a new economic approach focused on building partnerships, protecting relations with our European neighbours, and breaking down barriers to immigration. There has never been a more important time for the Liberal Democrats to fight for a bold, progressive agenda, because Boris Johnson's nationalist and isolationist government is a threat to our planet, our economy, and indeed the life chances of our young people. My heart lies in Europe, and Britain's long-term future, I am certain, is back in the European Union. But our immediate priority is to stop a no-deal Brexit and hold this government to account. And time after time, the Tories are failing British citizens abroad too, whether it's on pensions, voting rights, access to higher education, or simply treating people's futures as collateral damage in their disastrous Brexit project. But let's be clear, we can't change any of this.
30 seconds.
We continue as we are at 6% in the polls. We need a leader who can win back support and credibly communicate our vision, like I've done in the media over 400 times during this election. The momentum is with my campaign to move us forward. And I am delighted to have the backing of members internationally, from France to Malta, to Australia, to the Democratic Republic of Congo. So please, if you haven't already voted and you like what you hear in this hustings, show your support by voting for me and vote for change today. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla. So now it is Ed's turn.
Thanks, Hannah. Friends, these are challenging times. With the worst recession for perhaps 300 years, COVID, Brexit, the climate emergency. For every such challenge we face, international cooperation would make solutions so much easier. The Liberal Democrats' internationalist philosophy has always told us that working closely with other countries made sense, but it makes even more sense today in our increasingly globalized world. So as leader, a core objective would be rebuilding Britain's place in the world, using renewed British influence to fight the illiberal forces of nationalism and populism, regrettably so rampant in our world, and so regrettably embraced by the Conservatives. But I would need your help. To encourage you to be part of our revival, I want to make 3 commitments to you today if I'm leader. First, I will enable you to be actively involved in the party, using technology so you can contribute your skills and ideas. Second, I will give British citizens living abroad representation in Parliament now through Liberal Democrats in the House of Lords. And third, I will campaign relentlessly on the case for Britain to cooperate with the EU and to be at the heart of Europe, beginning with tackling the gross injustice that Brexit is already inflicting on so many British citizens across the EU. To enable you to be actively involved, already as acting leader, I've initiated a project to enable every Liberal Democrat member, wherever they live in the world, to take part in our party's policy development. A new system called Policy Lab has been piloted for the last 3 months with very promising results. On democratic representation, we will campaign to give you votes for life, but I want to do something now. I will appoint at least 2 existing Lib Dem members of the House of Lords to be your representatives in the British Parliament. 1 peer to represent British citizens living in Europe, 1 to represent all other British citizens living abroad. We must remain a proud pro-European party, making the case for cooperation on trade, climate change, COVID, and security. We must lead the rebuilding of a clear pro-European majority in Britain. And we must champion British citizens the world over and across Europe hit by Brexit. I want us to be your voice in Parliament. Friends, uniquely, I bring a combination of vision and experience to the role of leader. My vision of a greener economy, a fairer society, and a more caring country. And my political experience of 30 years in the party, 20 years in Parliament, 5 years in government, combined with a campaigning experience which has won 6 out of 7 elections. I know how to win, and I want us to win as Britain's leading internationalist party. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. So as we move now into the questions, the first topic that we're going to discuss is based around party strategy. And I have a question here from Mel Landalis. What would be your position on cooperating, formally or informally, with Labour to oust the Tories and subsequently in a possible coalition? And I will now have Ed first on that one.
Let's first of all rule out any coalition will deal with the Tories. Let's be clear about that. And then we need to build the party up as an independent force so that we are worth anyone cooperating with, so we can win more seats and beat Tories at the next election. But when it comes to a choice about a formal or an informal cooperation with Labour, I'm very clear. It has to be informal. We need it to be there because back in the day, we beat the Tories after 18 years when they had been in government in 1997 by an informal understanding. I was working with Paddy Ashdown and he managed to create this amazing choreography with Tony Blair where there was no formal pact, there was no formal deal, but there was an informal understanding. And it led to tactical voting for progressive parties on a massive scale, and we beat the Tories. And the same happened in 2001. And we need to rekindle that. And I would want to use my experience of those days when we managed to do that informal cooperation with Labour without causing problems on the ground, without preventing us from fighting Labour where we needed to in other parts of the country. I would want to bring that informal understanding so we did beat the Tories and we changed the politics of Britain for good.
Okay, thank you. Now, Leila.
Well, thank you, Mel. And I think this is a really important question in the context of the next Westminster election, but we also have to bear in mind that we are a party at, well, last poll I saw was 5%. We've got a huge problem in front of us, which is people don't know what we stand for. That was very clear in that general election review. So the first thing we have to do is to revive liberalism, is to have that broad message that appeals to both the right and the left so that we can win in those seats where we are second place, but also build up that base so that at every set of elections, whether it be the locals next year, the Senate, the Holyrood elections, and then all the way through, not just for one general election, but for 2. And that has to be the priority. But first past the post, we know means that when we are primarily second place to the Conservatives at the next election, and where the aim has to be to oust Boris Johnson and this charlatan, crony-filled government, then yes, we have to play ball. But my approach to this would not be the top-down unite to remain approach. It didn't work. One of the reasons it didn't work is because local parties felt imposed upon, and also there wasn't broad consensus, particularly with the Labour Party. So we do have to reach out to them, but it has to be bottom up. In Oxford, West and Abingdon, I overturned, quite unexpectedly, I should add, in 2017, a 10,000 Tory majority. And we did it by coordinating with
30 seconds
to decide. But then that sent a signal up to a progressive alliance of not just voters, but also activists on the ground that included Labour Party members who would campaign for us to oust the Tories in those seats. That is so obviously the right thing to do. And that is what I want to inspire, a grassroots campaign where in those seats where we can oust the Tories, we are working together in the interests of our voters and in the interests of the country.
Thank you, Leila. That is exactly time on that. So I'll move on to the next question we have from Shyamali Rodriguez. How would you sell liberalism in a succinct way to gain votes from non-Liberal Democrat voters? And we will go to Leila there.
Well, thank you for this. And to answer this question, I started, in fact, after that general election that we had, and notwithstanding, results in my own seat where I got over 50%, we have to recognize that we have lost our way. And it's liberalism that has not been being discussed in this country. And I went door knocking and I went to go speak to voters. I went to places that we don't hold seats, places like Leeds and Sheffield, Labour facing. I went to Devon and Cornwall and Wales and Kent. I was about to go to Scotland, which is of course a whole other beast, and coronavirus intervened. But I was asking that question, what do you think of us? What do you understand by liberalism? And what I would consider success as a leader is that at the next election, people know what it is. And it's this, and it's very simple, that those are the people fighting for my freedom. They want me to be free to lead the best life that I can possibly lead, where I have choices in front of me, where the opportunities are available to me, but they also recognize that to be free to do that, you also have to be free from ignorance, poverty, and conformity. And everything else stems from that. Any other policy area, we have to bring right back to why we care as liberals and start to make the case again, a generation after the last time we properly had this conversation as a party. What does liberalism mean for this modern age? Looking forwards 30 years, not backwards. How can we redefine this? That's the challenge for the party. And that's what I have been speaking about in this leadership election. And it's what I want to achieve immediately over the next few years, is that clear definition. Liberalism means freedom.
Okay, great. So next we've got Ed.
The most important thing in politics, in campaigning and winning elections, is to make sure your values and your policies are relevant to the person you're speaking, particularly if you're convincing them for the first time to vote Liberal Democrat. So our value of freedom needs to be related to the individual in front of you. So let's think about an unemployed person, a carer, or a young person. My proposal of a greener economy involves lots of green investment for green jobs, which would really help unemployed people or people fearful of their economic future. Let's make that climate change economic case for many of those people. And there are 10 million carers in the UK today, 3 times as many people who voted Liberal Democrat. I want us to be the voice of carers. And I want to say to a carer, we're going to enable you to manage your caring and work responsibilities more easily by passing you employment protections, which I've been working up as patron of the Disability Law Service. And so we will free you to be able to care and work. And I'd say to the young person, you're worried about housing, affordable housing, the availability of housing. Liberal Democrats have a whole range of policies to make sure we have investment in social housing and affordable housing at a level which will meet the needs of young people and young families. So the issue is making sure that the freedom that we're talking about is relevant to the person, whether they haven't got a job, whether they can't work because of their caring responsibilities, or whether a young person who can't afford something. It's making our liberalism relevant to people.
Okay, great, fantastic. So now we're moving on to a more political party-focused question. Which Liberal international member party or parties, excluding Canada because that's too easy, do you think the Liberal Democrats can learn the most from, and why? So, Ed.
Interesting question. I would have said Canada. I've always been fascinated by how Macron has managed it with En Marche. And maybe the people from the French party can give me some advice and give Leila and myself some advice about how that's developing. He's not without his controversy, but let's face it, he won power and he was outside the main 2 parties. So I think we could learn a lot from him, the way he managed to get a movement going and getting people to feel, yeah, you want to change the system from a centrist liberal position. So I certainly want to look to the French. I think the Ciudadanos movement in Spain is interesting. And then, you know, there's been successful liberal parties in Estonia, in Denmark, in Holland, not all sharing exactly our brand of liberalism, but there are members of Renew, or what used to be ALDE, the Association of Liberal Democrats in Europe. And so we should be looking to our sister parties to learn the lessons. And, you know, I wish we'd listened to them when we were in coalition, and I wish our leadership had done then, because they warned that as a junior party, you had to make sure your identity was kept. And I don't think we kept our identity properly. And it's one of the reasons why we did badly in 2015. So let's look at our liberal sister parties around the world. Let's focus ones that have most in common with us. And I think that will probably be in Europe.
Okay, thank you. And now we'll go to Leila on that one.
Yeah, well, I've always really inspired to see what other liberals around the world are doing. And yes, we need to work as part of ALDE, but also Liberal International, and actually use those networks, because it's one of the ways that we can still have influence. There are liberals in government. And Estonia was a particularly interesting trip that I made out there, speaking to the committee that was in charge of data protection. They've got a very liberal approach to data protection. It's a very advanced data economy. And the key to them was about transparency. Was in this digital age where we as a party fight for a digital bill of rights. It's one of the things that I think we do need to keep pushing as a party. There is a space for the protection of digital civil liberties, and we can learn a lot from the way that Estonia has responded to this. I also went to Gibraltar, where I spoke to our sister party there, and they have a really interesting arrangement with, in the centre-left parties, them and Labour fight the Tories together and then get into government as a result. Now, not what I think is feasible or indeed desirable in the UK, but nevertheless, the way that they've negotiated that and built that trust over time, there are certainly learnings that we need to pick from them. But the other party that I really also look to and I have huge admiration for and thanks to is D66. In the Netherlands. And one of the things that we certainly need to learn from them is how they have been in coalition in the Netherlands, but they kept their identity. They were successful in recent elections. They managed to do what sadly we didn't manage to do when we were in coalition. We need to learn from them so that if we are ever in that position again, how do we mitigate the downsides of being in any coalition? So there's a huge amount to learn from, and one that I'm very keen to continue to do.
Okay, thank you. So as a follow-up from that, there's consensus between the two of you about continuing to work with our sister parties in Europe, in ALDE and in Renew. Concretely, what would be your strategy to keep the British Liberal Democrats as strongly involved post-Brexit? And we go to Leila for that first, I think.
Well, we have an enormous resource in our MEPs and the connections that they made while they were there, but we do have those connections with those other parties. Concretely, what I want to do is the very first thing that we need to do is actually to start listening to the UK electorate. Again, we have to keep listening and learning. But as we do this, there is no reason at all why we can't start having bilateral meetings with other liberal parties around Europe and indeed around the world to understand and also to learn from them. We've done this in the past. We've had people from the Canadian Liberals come over and advise us. But actually, I do think it needs to be broader than that. And that whenever we learn from other liberal parties, it is a time for us to reflect on what we're doing and to work out what we do to get away from the position we are now. If you look at the last 10 years, it has been constant decline for our party. But there are liberal parties who are insurgent elsewhere. And the way that they often do it is that they recognize where they are. They learn to listen again. They learn from the best. They get at the cutting edge of campaigning, and they put out a clear, unabashedly liberal message. And that's how they start to make that success. We have 3 and a bit years between now and any potential next election. I don't think that Boris Johnson is going to give up his power anytime soon, as much as I may want it to be the case. And that means we have time to be able to build from scratch in a way that we do it together. And when I say together, my slogan in this campaign is move forwards together. The together part doesn't just apply to members. It also applies to other liberal parties across the world, because we have a huge amount that we need to learn from them too.
Okay, thank you. And now we will go on to Ed's response to that question.
I think there are two objectives in maintaining those relations. One is to keep the European awareness in our party strong and the European ambitions strong. And the second is to help our party in the UK build up a strong majority that's pro-European for the future. And so there are two things we need to do. We need to have constant meetings, and I've already arranged that MEPs from other EU countries would help with their travel budgets to get groups of Liberal Democrats to be able to visit Brussels and Strasbourg. They're able to do that, and they're able to help us manage that, and that's very kind of them to do that, but they've certainly offered it. And we can increase those contacts with our sister parties, with going to different conferences, various committees, but I'd like to make sure it's a member level as well. And then I'd also like to ensure that the stories, the pro-European stories, come back to help us, whether we're MPs or council leaders or whoever, here in British politics. Let's remember, Boris Johnson was part of the drip anti-European message that happened over a decade or 2 or 3 decades. We need to make sure the pro-European things are being heard in this country, because the press won't report it. So we need to have the information intelligence saying, look what's happening in Europe. Isn't this a good thing? Oh, we're not part of it. Oh, look at this great European cooperation. It's working really well and we're not part of it. We need to manage to get the case for European cooperation as a constant
30 seconds.
And I think whether it's people like our former MEPs, Graham Watson, people on this call, we need to bring that expertise together so we have the intelligence to make the case.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to a question about communication strategy. What will you do to ensure we have clear and consistent messaging that cuts through in the modern media landscape? And it was Leila to start there.
Thank you. This is really important. When we don't have that air of coverage by the media, you have to create it. And you have to be responsive on the one hand, but you always have to bring it back to those core liberal values. Whatever it is that you're talking about, it has to be clear why you are doing it. What is the liberal thread that runs through whatever it is that you're saying? So whether it be, this week we are seeing the A-level fiasco, we've got the GCSEs in front. What I focused on is the individual life chances of every young person. I try and mention phrases like that every time so that people understand that we as liberals care about those individuals and their opportunities in front of them, because that then links to everything else that we might say on something else. The other reason why it's important to have a good relationship with the media is because you can get stuff done. At the beginning of this crisis, I got a call from a constituent, someone who works on the front line of the NHS, worried for their family. What if they passed away? And I started campaigning, amassing cross-party support in the House for a coronavirus compensation scheme, similar to the army scheme. And then I got a call from the Daily Express newspaper, not normally a newspaper who is friendly to Liberal Democrats, but they said, we love this campaign, we're going to run it on our front page. They credited me and the party, and we made it happen. And now those bereaved families get £60,000 more than they might not have otherwise got. We can, using the media cleverly, in a way that makes clear why we are liberals, change lives now. It's why I'm leading the inquiry into coronavirus in the House. Again, cross-party, but that media, that cross-party support, that helps people understand that Liberal Democrats aren't just there sniping from the sidelines. They're getting into the thick
Thank you, Leila.
They're changing lives.
Okay, now Ed.
First of all, you have to have clear message discipline, and then you have to have the experience of dealing with a tough interview. On the message discipline, you need a clear brand for the party, a clear vision. I've been talking about a green economy fairer society, more caring country. And I would want the party to develop very quickly around that the clear messages, which we would use time and time again, repeat our messages. We get such little airtime. It's always been the case over my 30 years in the party. We need to use that airtime to get over the Liberal Democrat message, the Liberal Democrat narrative all the time. And that's very difficult for some people. You know, media for media's sake is no good. You need to have the discipline to get over the message so people know what we stand for. And then you've got to use those opportunities. So when I managed to get Boris Johnson at Prime Minister Questions, and I trapped him and he committed to a public inquiry into COVID, a statutory one, we got massive media coverage, the best we've had for a long, long time, on the 6 o'clock, the 10 o'clock, across the whole media. And it's again that quality media cut through that really gets noticed by the public. And finally, in my 20 years in Parliament, you know, I've been up against them all, whether it's the John Humphreys, the Jeremy Paxtons, the Cathy Newmans, the Sophie Ridges. I've been on Any Questions many times and Question Time many times. And I've more than held my own to get over those messages when it really counts in the run up to a general election, when people are really listening to us. So I believe that I've got the skills both in terms of the message discipline, which is so crucial, and the experience in those tough interviews.
Okay, thank you. Now we're going to move on to questions more focused on the leadership and the role of the leader. So firstly, how would your leadership inspire international members to remain with the party beyond the fight against Brexit? And I will ask Ed first on that one.
Well, I'd want to involve you, and I'd want to talk to you and listen to you and hear your ideas of how you'd like us to work with you. As I said in my opening remarks, I certainly see huge policy ideas that members across the world can bring. And that's why this new policy lab that I've led the initiative on will enable you as a party member, wherever you live, to be involved in policy debates. So you feel a real involvement in the direction of the party. But I'd also like to talk to you about how you can be involved in our elections and campaigns. Social media enables you, wherever you are in the world, to be part of a network of Liberal Democrat supporters. Imagine if we could harness that work. It could multiply our ability to get good social media in a council election, let alone a general election. So how can we campaign together and use your skills and knowledge? And then how can we use your expertise in building that Liberal Democrat knowledge? So whether you're the leader or a top party spokesperson, making sure we're on top of the issues, the big issues of the day. Yes, climate change, but the role of China. How are we going to respond to the battle and tensions between China and the United States? Sure, there are people out there in your local parties who really can advise us. So loads of ways that I'd like to talk to you about how you'd like to get involved, with a whole set of ideas about how you might get involved.
Okay, thank you. Now Leila.
Well, I remember growing up and even as an adult working in Belgium and looking across whenever I'd go back to the UK or watching the BBC, thinking to myself, my goodness me, politics in the UK can sometimes seem so parochial. It's not outward looking. Where are the big ideas? Where is the international stories where we are joining up what's happening in the big geopolitical shift that we're seeing across the world? And it made me actually not that interested in British politics until later, when I started to see those links actually through the eyes of a teacher, which is what I did before I was a member of Parliament. And to keep international members interested, yes, we need to involve them. And yes, I think Zoom and these kinds of technologies just make it that much easier. Certainly attending conference will be easier now that it's online. But I think what people also want to see is that there is a party in the United Kingdom that speaks up for internationalist values, that doesn't shy away from talking about those big human rights issues, from climate change to what's happening with the Uyghurs in China. We have to be at the forefront. And the reason why, if you look back at when the Liberal Democrats have done well, not just abroad, but also at home, it tends to be off the back of these big international issues. So we have to always be there, because that is one of the best ways that we can show people who we are as a party. And the reason why we are internationalist is because fundamentally, yes, we believe in freedom of the individual, but we also understand that to achieve that, you have to do it by cooperating, by collaboration, by not shying away from the big world out there, but embracing it and embracing everyone in it across the whole planet. And it's a completely different approach to Boris Johnson. It's a completely different approach to the authoritarian nationalist regimes we're seeing across the world. And it's a reason why we need to fight for liberalism now.
Thank you, Leila. Okay, so we've spoken a bit about how important our participation is as international members and how the current situation has made that easier. How concretely will you maintain that level of engagement going forward? For example, could we still call into conferences and things like that? So we'll take Leila first on that one.
Yes, absolutely. I see no reason why we should be moving backwards now that we have discovered that this is possible. And whilst online conference, there will be parts of it that I will miss, and I wish there was a way that we could have a sort of hybrid conference. Nevertheless, it's a really important innovation, and one that I don't understand why we didn't do 10 years ago. It just made no sense to me. As soon as we had Skype or these kinds of technologies, we should have been implementing them, and it shouldn't have taken a pandemic for us to get to this point. And it's not just those who are abroad. I'm also hearing similar lamentations from people in the regions who it's just too expensive. Or if you're someone who's got caring responsibilities, you've got a job that doesn't allow you to leave for a few days in that way, to be able to be dipping in and out is so much more accessible. So I would want to see that continue. Now, of course, the job of the leader is to indicate these things, to put their political weights behind it. But the general election review does make clear that that three-legged chair, that three-legged stool, that also includes the CEO and the president, you have to work in concert together. You have to work in concert with the rest of the party. I sense that in the party, there is definitely a move to keep that participation going. And I can certainly assure all of you that I will be a leader who is accessible to all members, no matter where they are, not just in the country, but also around the world.
Okay, thank you. Ed.
Well, I think the COVID experience has changed everything. And I think as a party, we need to embrace these changes completely, whether it's Liberal Democrats living in Europe and overseas, or whether it's Liberal Democrats in different regions of the country, as Leila said. Zoom is part of that. But as I've mentioned twice before, this policy lab platform that I've helped encourage and initiated will enable, through a media a bit like Zoom, but a bit more sort of intelligent for debates, for people to be engaged. But why don't we take that further? Yes, we can have Zoom conferences, but there's no reason why we shouldn't have Zoom speaker meetings. There's no reason why we can't have sort of speaker socials like we do in local parties, but actually it could be a global speaker meeting. The Labour Party, to activate their members, particularly after Momentum got involved, though that's probably not a great analogy, but they had a lot more speaker meetings online. And if you look at other liberal parties around the world, and frankly, even right-wing parties, they've used online training tools that have been specifically bespoke to different groups in the party who've got different roles. So why don't we have special training modules online to help people living abroad to be involved in local campaigning, whether it's through social media, through emails, or whatever it may be. So I think there's a huge seam here which we can mine to engage membership across the world far more concretely than we've ever done before. And I've already suggested that every single party committee that's at the national level, I'm not sure if you can do this at the local level, but the national level, it should be required that if someone can't attend in person, they should be allowed to attend over Zoom or similar technology. This could bring the party closer together. It could really maximize our strengths. And I think particularly for Liberal Democrats abroad, I think it has huge potential to enable you to be far more involved in the party. But we can't just talk about it, we've got to do it, which is why this policy lab that I've set up, I hope will help people.
Thank you. Okay, so moving on to, we've had some mentions of the general election review. What will you do to guarantee real action following that review and prevent it from being put in the too difficult pile? Ed?
Well, I'm very proud of the review. I co-commissioned it with the federal board. It was my idea that Dorothy Thornhill chaired it. And I was also determined that the remit that it had, which the federal board agreed to, didn't just look at 2019, but looked at a period of elections over the last few years when I think we've been going wrong. So I was delighted when Dorothy decided that she would publish her report before the federal board even saw it, and that really, I think, drove a lot of the debate. Some members of the federal board didn't like it, but it ensured that the debate got out there, the report got out there, warts and all. And it pulls no punches, and quite rightly too, because there's been too many mistakes, not just in 2019, but for those of us who've been campaigning the party for 30 years, we've seen things going wrong over the last few elections, particularly with local campaigning not being given the prominence and support that it needs, and it's been too much top-down campaigning. So I would say this, Hannah, the general election review is music to my ears. I want it to be implemented. I've already been speaking to the new chief executive, Mike Dixon, about how he's going to go ahead to implement it, as well as Mark Pack as president through the federal board. It has to be implemented, and it will be an absolute top priority. There is no way this review will gather dust. It will be implemented if I'm leader.
Thank you, Ed. Now, Leila.
Well, I think it's very important that actually both Ed and I have said that we are behind the review. So whoever wins, there is now a mandate for it. And that was incredibly important to do. But the thrust of the question, that this is going to be difficult, is absolutely right. In my experience outside of Parliament, I was a teacher for over 10 years. And for the last few years, I was a part of a senior leadership team in a social enterprise. And what I became good at was change management. We would manage students, we would manage changes of curriculum, we would wind products up and down and have to report to shareholders. And just before being elected, I'd secured a job in a French lycée, actually, to introduce the International Baccalaureate, because they recognized my skills as someone who understands how to implement change and how to lead change in large organizations. So I have experience of this outside of my Westminster job. And critical to it is, first of all, coordinating the sequence of how this is going to be done, working with the president and the CEO, mentioned it before, but it's very important, that triumvirate, that collaboration that is led from the top, but then is embodied in every single decision that is taken after that. And the way the leader can best serve this is to continue to hold those who have to implement it, which is, of course, the federal board, but also the CEO and the president, to account, to put their political capital behind it, and to make sure that we have clear milestones along the way. Because unless it is implemented at least 18 months out before the next Westminster election, change takes time to implement well, and it needs to bed in. So we are going to have to work incredibly fast, and it will be a focus of mine as leader of this party. On that, you can be assured.
Thank you. Okay, so finally in this section, this is a question from Charlie Duquesne. What key experiences will each candidate bring to the job that will make them a successful leader? Leila.
Thank you. Well, my experience has been primarily outside of the Westminster bubble. And I don't think that's a bad thing at this time, when there is an inherent distrust in politicians and indeed in the party, and winning back trust, particularly, and not just coalition, but we saw what Revoke went down as, especially in parts of our former heartlands. Starting to listen again, starting to win back trust is what we have to do. And gaining trust and making sure that you are inspiring every single person around you to get the best out of them is what I do. It's what I brought into Westminster with me. It's what I did as the youngest ever head of year when I was just 21 in my first ever school, the international school in Brussels. I then went on to lead teams for the whole of my life outside of Westminster. And in Westminster, I lead cross-party, most recently leading the inquiry into coronavirus as part of the all-party group, because the government didn't get its act together in time to act before a second wave. I bring this experience, but I also bring an understanding of how people out there, regular punters, see our party, and that the key thing that we need to do, and I will keep saying it, is that we need to revive liberalism. They need to understand what liberalism is again, and you start from where they are, not intellectual purism, by understanding what is it that really works them up, that gets them up in the morning and they go, I wish someone would sort that out. And if we can get on that side of people, if they can recognize that the Liberal Democrats are a party getting things done and on their side, that is how we're going to build back this party and move forward into the future, rather than keep explaining about what happened in the past.
Okay, thank you. Now, Ed.
Charlie, it's my personal experience, my business experience, and my political experience. My personal experience is primarily as a carer. My dad died when I was 4, my mum became terminally ill when I was 12, and I nursed her with my brother till she died when I was 15. So I was a young carer, and I had to grow up quite quickly. And then brought up my grandparents. Eventually my granddad died and my grandmother became frail, and I was in charge of her caring for a decade. And now I have 2 lovely kids, my wife Emily. One of them, John, my son, who's 12, is severely disabled. He can't walk or talk, and so he needs 24/7 care. So I've had a lot of caring experience, and I think that helps me relate to people, relate to the 10 million carers in Britain. And I think it helps me have a degree of empathy with people going through real problems. And I think that's pretty helpful in politics. In business, I was a management consultant for 4 years. I'm an economist by training. I did a postgraduate in night school. So I've got quite a lot of experience. And then when I was out of Parliament for 2 years, I set up my own business and consultancy. So I've got a lot of business experience too. And then of course, in politics, I've been in the party 30 years, Parliament 20, in government 5. And that's taught me a lot about how you work with constituents and with voters. I've won 6 out of 7 elections, so big campaigning experience. But I've also learned how to negotiate within the party, negotiate with other parties, negotiate with Whitehall, negotiate with the EU, negotiating with the United Nations. And one of the core tasks of a leader, if we get near to power,
30 seconds.
is how you negotiate. So I think my lifetime experience, my business experience, and my political experience is quite a unique combination, which will help me lead our party.
Okay, thank you. We've had a question just come in from Martin Bennett asking, what is your vision of liberalism? Ed.
It's to give people maximum freedom. And that's freedom from the state being overbearing on you and abusing you. So your civil rights, your civil liberties, your human rights, your freedom. But it's also freedom to be able to be the best person you can be. So we believe in giving equal opportunity to children, young people, to enable them to have their life and live their life to its fullest. That means we have a positive case for investment in education, in public service, and so on. And that freedom also is to businesses and to people who want to get on in life, creating businesses, trading, being part of a successful business. So that freedom, I think, is essential for the individual. So the state and indeed big companies and big unions and so on don't oppress their individual. It's also freedom so people can live their lives, but it's also freedom for society and our economy. And I think liberalism is about that freedom in the UK, but respecting that freedom for every individual human being wherever they live, that dignity, that respect for every individual, no matter their color, their creed, their race, their religion, their ability, their sexuality. It's about celebrating the human being. That's what liberalism is.
Thank you. Leila?
Well, I partly answered this question in the earlier one, and it was, as I say, these are the people who fight for freedom, freedom to, freedom from. But let me put it another way, perhaps. It's also ensuring that every individual has the freedom and security to live life as they choose. And if we take the 3 E's of the campaign that I've been leading so far, by the way, those were chosen after speaking to voters, and they led me to those positions. And education is top of the list, not just because I'm a former maths and physics teacher, coming in very handy, I have to say, over the debacle over the last few days. But actually the reason why I was a teacher and the reason why I'm a liberal is because I want to get the best out of every single person so that they can choose the future that is best for them. What better way of talking about liberalism than investing in the next generation? But environment was also very high up on the agenda. And when we talk about liberalism and we talk about the environment, we recognize that liberalism understands that every single part of society, whether it be the state, business, through individual choice, and indeed through local government, that bottom-up approach that I often talk about, is all part of the different levers and sinews that we need to stretch in order to achieve these huge goals that we have, not just as a country, but as a planet. And that collaborative approach that comes with liberalism is something that we need to continue to talk about. And the third area is the economy. It's why I've been talking about a universal basic income, so that we don't let people fall through the cracks. And the thing that gets me up in the morning is inequality, and tackling that everywhere that we see it, whether it be in our own council estates in the UK, or whether it be for the poorest refugees who are trying to swim to our shores because they are on the raw end of some dictator or some economic crash. We have to be there for them.
Thank you, Leila.
Well.
Okay, so now we're going to move on to a section about the concerns of our local party. And first we have a question from Nat Sweet. In future elections, what will be your policy for the EU? A people's vote, rejoin, or another option? So Leila.
Well, throughout this campaign, we have been asked this question, and let me make very clear, and as I said in my opening remarks, my heart lies with us being in the European Union. I'm absolutely gutted by where we are now. I went to the European school twice. The first flag I ever drew was an EU flag. I very much identify as being European as much as I do being British. And that is where I want us to return. But we also have to recognize the political realities of where we are, both as a party, but also where the country is. And I think the path that leads back to the rejoin position, which is where I would like us to see, and if I was to, straw in the wind, when would I like us to get us there? Maybe not by the next election. It might not happen until then, but never say never, but maybe the one after that. We have to bring public opinion along with us. We have to show people through concrete examples why this was not the Brexit that they voted for, not in an I told you so kind of way, but just in a we are on your side kind of way. All those farmers, all those fishermen who are now being thrown under the bus by Boris Johnson because he wants to get into bed with Trump and have a trade deal there instead. The lowering of animal welfare standards, the lowering of our environmental standards. These are the things that people on doors really care about. And it's absolutely right that we stand up for them while making the point that these were British EU standards that we helped to co-create. And wouldn't it be great if we were part of it again? So anytime that there is an opportunity to make the positive case for why closer cooperation with the European Union now is the right thing to do, will hopefully slowly over time, by building that cross-party consensus, by talking about it in the media, shift public opinion so that we get closer and closer and closer to that aim that I want, which is for the country to want to move to that rejoin position. Believe me, when that door begins to creak open with me as leader, we will be first in line through it.
Thank you, Leila. And now we go to Ed.
Well, Leila's right. We've been asked this question on many hustings. We've all had the same answer. I don't think there's a cigarette paper between Leila and myself on this. We're both passionately pro-European, and we want to lead a principled pro-European party. And the real question is, how do we get back to the heart of Europe? And what's the best way of doing that? And the problem we faced the last election when we went to the revoke position was we turned off a lot of voters. It wasn't the only thing that lost us votes, but there's no doubt that it did lose us votes. People thought we were tin-eared. Even Remain supporters thought the revoke position was undemocratic. And while you could explain it to them, they didn't get it. And I think if we went ahead of public opinion at the next election, so we're going to rejoin come what may, even if the polls don't want it, I think we would have another situation like we did with revoke. So I think we've got to change public opinion. The good news is public opinion looks like it is beginning to change. The polls suggest that a bigger percentage of people now wanting to be in the European Union, but it's not as solid as it needs to be. And we have got to make the case for European cooperation, not incentively and saying, you guys were wrong on the Leave side, but by making the case that actually, given COVID, given climate change, maybe better cooperation and more cooperation is the way forward.
30 seconds.
Gradually move that over. And if we can do that, then we can hopefully change public opinion so we can then lead it and lead it back to the EU.
Okay, thank you. Kay Brain and Meg Fenn and Paul Fisher, so this is quite a popular question in our local party, want to know how hard you will fight to secure the human rights of UK citizens who lost their votes in the UK after 15 years away and now lose the right to vote in their EU countries of residence, as they will not have any vote anywhere. Ed.
I think it should be a top priority. We also need to expose the Tories for their hypocrisy. There was a private members bill which the government was supporting, which was going to give votes for life. And then when they realised that Brexit and other nationalistic policies the Tories was turning off a lot of the people who lived abroad who they thought were their natural supporters, they unceremoniously dropped the bill. We were supporting the bill, and I believe we should continue to make the case for votes for life when British citizens live abroad. This is what's happened in other countries. And I want to go further. One of the ways we can win future elections is if we enable more people living abroad to be part of our campaigning, able to vote for us. And so I think this is really in the party's interests. It's one of the reasons I said in my opening remarks, I'd like to create a spokesperson in the Lords, two spokespeople in the Lords, one to represent British citizens living in Europe and one to represent British citizens living elsewhere in the world, so that you have a spokesperson in Parliament who doesn't have a normal constituency, but is in the House of Lords, who can ask the questions, make the case, potentially even take up casework, but be campaigning on this issue so the human rights that have been taken away from you can be restored. And we also need to think about how we can persuade other countries to give you those voting rights back. It may be an issue of reciprocal agreement that obviously may well come, and we need to push for that hard.
30 seconds.
But whether that comes or not, we need to campaign for your rights in the country you live in and back here in Britain.
Okay, thank you. Layla?
Well, very hard. I mean, this is a no-brainer. And as I mentioned earlier, this affects my family. And so I absolutely want to ensure that we hold the Tories to their own manifesto commitment, that they get this done. That private members bill that was part of the last Parliament, I sat on the bill committee and I was excited to be part of it. I put down amendments that would include overseas constituencies, and we kept having pushback from the government. But actually the reason why it was dropped was because of Labour. And Labour decided that because it was shenanigans in the House, and this is just classic Westminster politics, it was a tit for tat, the Tories wouldn't give a money resolution to some other very worthy bill, and so Labour decided that they wouldn't support it, and so it was dropped. And I just find this utterly, utterly ridiculous, because it is in no one's best interest that you or anyone else is disenfranchised. And I've also worked very, very hard to secure the rights of EU citizens in the UK, and went to Brussels in a cross-party delegation led by a Tory with other Tories. Indeed, Tory Brexiteers were there, where we were making the case for those reciprocal arrangements to be there. The key to getting this done in time for the next election, from the position that we are now, is cross-party working. We are the fourth party in Parliament. When we are going to be leveraging our power, it's going to have to be cross-party, and it's what I have proven that I'm very good at in the Houses of Parliament through the work that I've done by sitting on the Public Accounts Committee, through other committees that I've been on. I have a reputation in the House for being a very straight shooter, for saying what I think and being reliable, and that will help us achieve these aims. So yes, this is incredibly important for all sorts of different reasons, but at its core, the very liberal reason that every individual, every citizen of this country deserves to have their voice heard. No ifs, no buts.
Okay, thank you. We've had a follow-up on that from Andrew Houndsley. Will you support overseas members in campaigning for this immediately? Layla?
Absolutely, in any way that I can. And if it's a case of we need to work with our sister liberal parties in the countries where you are, where we're trying to secure your right to vote there, I've already said how I think we need to be doing it in the House, and it needs to be cross-party. Wendy Chamberlain has been doing some brilliant work on this already, and in fact had a adjournment debate quite recently where she was talking about this very matter. We absolutely need to make sure that we are on both sides doing what we can to support you. So in any way that we can support you, I absolutely will.
Okay, thank you. Ed?
Andrew, absolutely. Let's start. Let's get the petitions going. Let's get the strategies going, whether it's in countries where you live, whether it's in the Houses of Parliament. Let's try and get that civic welling up of support. And let's be clear who our opponents will be. They will be in the right-wing press, and that's a good thing. Let's take them on. Let us make the case and bang the drum for internationalism. Let's stick to our democratic international principles. This is a campaign which brings all those values together. So absolutely, very keen to work with you on it.
Okay, thank you. On the topic of our democratic internationalist principles, George Cunningham asks, how should the UK and the party manage its relationship with a China that is gradually reshaping the world to its authoritarian model, challenging our liberal values? Ed?
It's a huge question in 2 minutes. Clearly, there's huge problems with the way China behaves on human rights, whether it's its appalling activities in Hong Kong, whether it's with the Uyghur Muslims in the western province of Xinjiang. But it goes beyond that. There's issues on climate change, issues on trade. And the really big issue, which I want to raise and focusing on, which I think is the challenging one, is if and when China becomes the superpower. There's a real tension now between the United States and China. You can see it. And it's not just Trump. It goes much deeper than Trump. Even Joe Biden, if he becomes president, is likely to be pretty hostile towards China. And President Xi, now president for life, is very determined for China to become the superpower. And in history, when superpower status has been challenged, and we're going back the centuries now, more often than not, that's resulted in conflict, in war. So this is a very serious situation. Serious on human rights, serious on the economy, but serious on peace. And so I would want, as leader, to commission a whole series of work to focus on how we as a liberal Democrat party play our role, get our thinking right on how we work with this new superpower, to try to move it away from authoritarian policies to a more liberal outward-looking basis. That's not going to be easy, incredibly difficult, but it's the challenge, it's a challenge that we should face up to, and I'd like your help, George, and others.
Okay, thank you. Leila?
Thank you, George. This is obviously in the news all the time, most recently with the Uyghur human rights abuses, which, by the way, had been going on for years. And it wasn't until Alistair Carmichael took this up in the House, and he was the first parliamentarian to start calling cross-party for something to be done. There's interestingly cross-party support for this in the House, and so long it should continue. But the other thing that I really credit him on is the work that he's done, taken up the mantle of Hong Kong. And we've seen there a rolling back of democracy, increasing, as you say, authoritarian input from the Communist People's Party, and we need to challenge that. But we also need to take a grown-up approach to geopolitics about it. The reason why we need to challenge it is liberal values, is recognizing that we need to stand up for international human rights and the international rule of law. And these things are very important. And that is the cornerstone of what we need to be talking about when we talk about these issues. But we also can use it as an opportunity to show that whilst I think pulling Huawei out of our 5G network was the right move, the primary reason why it was happening was because we wanted to cozy up to Trump in our so-called special relationship with a man who is bluntly deranged. And it's the wrong reason, but the right thing to do. So we need to take a pragmatic approach. And it's one that is what I would describe a critical acquaintance. Where sanctions are possible and where they are done multilaterally, staying close to the European Union where we can, if consensus can be found there. That is certainly one of the levers that I would want us to look to pull. But they are also a big trading partner for the UK. And so balancing that is very, very difficult. The liberal approach is to stand up for human rights and democracy, no matter where they are under threat in the world, and to continue to point out that actually our best interests always lie closest to the European Union.
Thank you, Leila. Right, so Moving on to Russia. Andrei Mikev asks, would you agree that Russia's actions pose a critical national security threat to the UK? And what action can the Lib Dems take on the issue? How can we push for the release of the full Intelligence and Security Committee report? Leila.
Yes, well, I mean, yes, absolutely, they are a threat. And the Russia report, as released, as redacted as it may be, showed us that it is not just a threat, but it has already potentially affected our own democracy, starting with the 2014 referendum in Scotland, and then continuing, of course, through Brexit itself. And what I have consistently called for is not just the full report to be published, but we also need a proper judicial inquiry into the Brexit referendum itself. And at this stage, and especially if it doesn't take hold before, sadly, we may go off that cliff edge of no deal, or even with a bad Brexit, it needs to happen, because at its core is a threat to our very democracy, is our own committee saying to Parliament, we think that there was interference. We think that people were unduly influenced. And it was an international state actor that did this. And this is part of a Russia that, as we have seen over the last few years, getting increasingly paranoid, increasingly concerned with Putin's own position of power. And the way that he consolidates it is to create as much chaos and as much otherness elsewhere in the world as possible. And what we can do as a nation to combat this, well, first of all, we do need to tackle this infringement on our civil liberties online and our own democracy in our own country. It's why I think we should be actively calling for a digital bill of rights. We need to be holding those social media companies to account, and we do need to be properly funding those parts of our defense service who are looking at this and are currently underfunded. So this is an enormous geopolitical issue that has real implications for our democracy and our civil liberties in the UK. And yes, we should be at the forefront of fighting it, because again, it goes to the heart of why we are liberals.
Thank you, Leila. Ed.
Andrei, I've long argued in the public domain that Britain wasn't taking the Russian threat seriously. I found in the coalition government that the Tories didn't take it seriously, and I've often wondered whether it was to do with their links to Russian oligarchs. And I take that very seriously. When I was Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, I served on the National Security Council, which meant it met every week in 10 Downing Street and looked at all the foreign policy security issues. And I was very taken, particularly after the Russian invasion into Crimea and the battles in eastern Ukraine, with how damaging the Russian influence was across Europe and across the world. And I raised it at the G7 Energy Ministers meeting, which I went to in Rome, and I raised it at the EU Council on Energy. And I was arguing, and I developed Europe's energy security strategy. Europe's energy security strategy was actually written in my office in Whitehall, and we passed it as what's called a non-paper to the EU. The Commission put it into Eurocrat language, and it was adopted. And the whole point of that was to reduce the amount of fossil fuel imports from Russia into the whole of Europe. So there'd be less money going to the pocket of the Kremlin, the pocket of Putin. And look how he uses that money. He's already using it in places like Belarus, where he's offered military assistance. This man is a danger in our world, and we haven't taken it seriously enough. I'm afraid the interference in our elections and the report of the ISC is just one example, but it goes back much longer. And I just urge you, go into the Google and look at my articles I've written on this, particularly when I use powers never used before to stop a Russian company called Letter One buying North Sea oil assets. I was very worried as a cabinet minister that that was against Britain's national security. The Tories tried to stop me. I pushed it through. You've got to be tough on Russia.
Thank you, Ed. So on that note, we've had another question come through from a member, Martin Bennett, asking how Liberal Democrats should react to recent events in Belarus. Ed.
Well, I wish we were part of the European Union, because I'd be wanting in the Foreign Affairs Committee there to make sure that we were taking action to support the opposition forces there. You have a dictator there who has just stolen an election. And you have people like Putin who are offering support. We need to stand up for human rights, and we need to stand up for democracy. So we need to work with other countries, including even Trump's America, to take action, whether it's sanctions or other means, to try to make sure that the democratic voice of the people of Belarus gets heard.
Ed, you might be having connection issues. Your voice is very distorted.
I need the power back. Excuse me.
I can't hear you now. I'll just bear with him briefly. Right. Okay, talk amongst yourselves. I'll have a drink break.
Is that better?
That is much better. Okay, carry on.
Sorry about that. I'd finished. I could see the power going. I thought I was going to go off air, so apologies for that.
Oh, right. Okay, we didn't get most of it. So if you've got about a minute left, if you want to do a brief recap.
I was simply saying that we need to be part of an international coalition working particularly with our European partners, but I would also suggest even Trump's America, maybe across NATO, to put pressure on the dictator in Belarus to try to make sure we can support the democratic voice of the people of Belarus. It will be difficult because we'll have Putin backing the dictator.
That's
we have to stand up.
Okay, right, and now we'll go to Leila on that one.
Well, broadly speaking, from what I heard from Ed at the end, and Ed, it happens to us all. It's Zoom life, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, broadly speaking, of course, we have to stand up for the protesters. We have to stand up anywhere in the world where democracy is being stymied, where we are seeing unscrupulous authoritarians absolutely mistreating their own citizens. It doesn't matter if they aren't British citizens. We have to stand up for them because this is at the core of who we are as a party. I've already tweeted and spoken about this a bit already this week. We need to keep a very close eye on the situation. I think Putin's intervention this morning was not entirely unexpected, but as ever, deeply concerning. And it just underlines how much less influence we have in the world because we aren't part of the European Union. We would be so much more effective with sanctions on Lukashenko and this undermining of democracy, both in Belarus and anywhere else in the world. We have to stand up for. You know, we absolutely need to stand up for these individuals who are being unduly cracked down on by this government. And I think actually when we go back in a few weeks' time to Parliament, actually, I hope we might be recalled earlier, given the mess that the UK is in right now. I will be pushing, I'm sure with others, for this not to be forgotten, and that Parliament then is able to exert itself with whatever force it has left.
Okay, thank you, Leila. So we'll now move on to another foreign policy topic. Caden Davidson asks about voter suppression tactics in the USA with the US Postal Service and the issue on Brexit with social media manipulation and foreign donors. And he says, how will you protect people's rights to free and open elections? So that's Leila on that one.
Well, thank you, Caden. I've spoken a couple of times today about why a digital Bill of Rights is so important. It's a part of my vision for the country that I released as part of my campaign. And I think it's incredibly important. And it was really driven home to me how important it was. I've been doing a bunch of research on this more recently. And there's a book called Democracy Hacked, which I would highly recommend to anyone who's interested in how this has happened. And it's to do with bot farms, primarily actually initially being run out of Russia. But then we saw the way that Facebook ended up being essentially complicit with people like Cambridge Analytica. And many of those connections feed right into the heart of this Tory government. We cannot expect that they are the ones who are going to take up this mantle. And yes, we are seeing what's happening in America. I follow people in America who talk about this and gerrymandering. And in fact, we're seeing elements of gerrymandering in the bringing in of ID and identification in order to vote in this country, which deeply, deeply concerns me. So we need to push this. And what I would like to see is the party develop this digital bill of rights. We've spoken about it, we've had it in our manifesto for a long time, and I would like to see us put some flesh on that bone, on those bones, because it speaks right to the heart of what's going on in society at the moment, not just in terms of elections and our democracies, but also in terms of our own digital identities. If we are a party that protects civil liberties, then we should be a party absolutely at the forefront of the issues that have come with this digital age. And we are not libertarians who believe, well, let's just let it all happen and sort it out later. We need much stronger regulation now so that we can protect the individual liberty of the citizen, whether it be in the physical world or in the online one.
Thank you. Ed?
We absolutely have to stand up for our democracy and prevent the corruption of it. Let me take the three issues that you raised, Kat, and apply them to the UK. You first raised postal voter problems, which we're seeing in the USPS, United States Postal Service. I don't think that's a problem in the UK. There has been some problem with postal voter fraud in a few places, but it's been clamped down on. And the Conservative idea of voter ID, I think, is really a bad one. And I think there's no evidence behind it. And I think actually our system of postal voting in the country, while we should never be complacent, I think it's much better than in many other countries. And the Electoral Commission as a watchdog needs to be properly resourced, but it is a good regulator of those sorts of aspects of our democracy. I think foreign money remains a problem. It's not such a big problem as in other countries because we do have strong laws, but I personally would like to see a major reform of party finance and party funding for elections. So it's a lot fairer, that would obviously benefit us, but also so it was even more transparent. But to be fair, we are more transparent than many countries. The big issue is social media manipulation. The government have put forward some legislation in their online harms white paper. Daisy Cooper, our excellent new MP for St Albans, and our spokesman on DCMS issues, which covers data, has done some excellent work in taking this forward. And we need to expose it where it's happening. That's why the previous question from Andre on the Intelligence Service Committee report is so important. But we need to go further. We need to have strong policies pushing stronger sentences for people found in breach, and also proper defense measures, because particularly when this is a foreign attack from
Sorry, that's time.
we need to stop that.
Okay, thank you. Just as a brief follow-up on that one, these online harms rules, you've both spoken about kind of digital rights. How can we best uphold people's civil liberties while tackling these threats that we face when those two things come into conflict? Ed?
We have to apply our principles and values to them. Sometimes there is a balance to be struck between the two. The government traditionally, under Labour and the Tories, have wanted to be on the side of the security services and ensure that the digital rights apply to the state, not to the individual. And we traditionally have fought back against the proposal, for example, for a snooper's charter. And I think that's a liberal position, not a libertarian position. And I'd want us to maintain that. I think it's really, really important that there is a proper evidence-based analysis of the demands of the security forces for ever more intrusion into the digital sphere. And if you looked at some of the proposals we fought off in the past, essentially the security forces wanted the right to have fishing trips to anybody and everybody, even when there was no evidence. And we fought back to say, no, we will grant you access to WhatsApp messages and all the rest of it if you have some evidence against that individual. And I think that is the right way to manage that balance, so that you require the police, the MI6, MI5, whoever it may be, to at least have some evidence before they go and breach civil liberties in terms of digital
30 seconds.
information, rather than them being able to just do a blanket approach, which really would undermine your and my civil liberties.
Okay, thank you. Leila.
Well, this is a really important question for our society, and arguably, this is one of the areas where Parliament can play a really important part. The International Security Committee should be playing a much more important part in the finessing of where those lines are, because GCHQ don't want to. They don't want to be the ones to have to draw the line. It needs to be led by our most sovereign Parliament. The problem we have, of course, is that Boris Johnson gives no regard to the ISC, as we've seen in particular with the shenanigans over the last few weeks and the gerrymandering of not getting Failing Grayling to lead it, which I have to say was a bit of a coup by the backbenchers of the Tory party. For once, I did absolutely agree with them. But we have to continue to press this issue in our own way, in our own liberal way. I was very interested to see, and I mentioned Estonia earlier, when I met with them, we discussed this at some length. And it was in the context, of course, of Russia, because they are right next door, and they recognize that that cyber threat is very real and very present in their country all the time. But as part of that, they've taken a liberal approach, which involves maximum transparency. And there is a government portal where you can put in for whatever data the government may have about you. They have much stronger laws than we do. And in the implementation of things like GDPR, which is of course quite new and a robust piece of legislation that was of course constructed at the EU level, we need to be putting the resources behind them. But we have to continue to have these conversations as a country. It is the biggest Wild West issue that we have not got on top of. I do not trust the Tories to deal with this. Their libertarian wings and their over-protectionist state-driven wings just don't have the capacity, the intellectual capacity to get to grips with this. The way to get to grips with this is a digital Bill of Rights.
Thank you, Leila.
And the Liberal Democrat approach to it.
Okay. So moving on to, I think, potentially the last question in the interests of time before your closing statements. Colin Bloodworth asks what you can do personally as leader to support British pensioners whose pensions were frozen when they left the UK, particularly with these COVID-19 financial struggles that they face. So, Leila.
Thank you. Well, I'm very well aware that this is a top priority campaign and it is an injustice. The way that it's going to be tackled is, what can I do personally? Well, first of all, it's work with you on that campaign. And I'm very well aware that I don't know what has been done by the party in the past, but I do think it's something we need to help you with, because it is a really important thing to engage with you on. But separately to that, it is that cross-party working in the House, but also abroad, to ensure that those pensions are uprated in the way that they should have been. It is an utter travesty that there are pensioners in other parts of Europe who are now currently living on way below, way below what pensioners are living here. And it's just not right. So I would work with you, I would work across parties, and let's run this campaign together and try and get something achieved.
Okay, thank you, Leila. Ed?
Colin, as you may or may not know, as acting leader, I wrote to the Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, Teresa Coffey, to argue that in the COVID situation, there was an urgent need for addressing this issue, at the very least as a one-off during COVID. But I also made the case longer term. And I would absolutely want to work with you campaigning long term on this issue. And we have to demolish the government's arguments against this and the Treasury's arguments against it. Now, at one stage, they talk about the need for reciprocal arrangements. But in countries like Australia that's had them and has asked the UK government to reciprocate, the UK government hasn't. So that's a hypocritical argument that's been used, and we need to expose it. There's always also the argument that actually Britain does very well if many of its retirees are living abroad. And please don't take this the wrong way, but people who are living in the UK who are retired tend to use the National Health Service far more. The proportion of the amount of money spent on the NHS, which is spent on people in their later years, is much greater than in their younger years for obvious reasons. And so actually there's a big saving to the taxpayer. And that sort of argument is a sort of argument which you might be able to persuade the Treasury to use and to
30 seconds.
So I think we need to make this argument. We need to make it with an objective way, with an evidence-based, but ultimately it's about justice, and we need to fight for justice.
Okay, thank you. Just a kind of fun, kind of quick fire, 1 minute answer before we go into your closing speeches. If you were to emigrate, which country would you choose to live in and why? Ed?
Oh, quick fire. France, because I love the wine.
All right, that's fair enough. Layla?
Well, this was always the easy option for me, having grown up in so many different parts of the world. It would probably depend on, the reason I'd be emigrating is because I'd have lost my seat. I'd probably end up heading an international school somewhere, and it would depend on the job. But I will say that just before I was offered the job in the lycée in Wembley, I was considering going to China, but maybe not anymore.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so we'll now move into your closing speeches, and I will take Ed to go first there.
Well, thanks, Hannah. I hope I've shown you I have the vision, experience and judgment to lead the Liberal Democrats. We should be proud to be the Liberal Party of Britain, fighting for freedom, for human rights, for civil liberties. Proud to be the most pro-European party, the most internationalist party in Britain today. Championing cooperation between nations and people, leading the campaigns for peace and climate change. Proud to fight for a fairer society, whether that's affordable housing, better care or increased investment in education. But we need to recognise that our liberal values are under sustained attack from the right and from the left, nationalists, populists. The challenge for liberalism has never been greater in my lifetime. Friends, I want to use my life experience and my political experience to fight back. This will not be easy given the challenges facing our party. As a Thornhill general election review showed, there are no quick fixes. There never has been. While times seemed tough after December's disastrous election, I remember the first nationwide election 11 months into Paddy Ashdown's leadership. We scored less than 6%. But I also remember how Paddy led our rebuilding. Just as previous successful leaders have done, I will start by laying firm foundations, winning campaigns in councils across the country, and next May winning more seats in Scotland, Wales, and London. Building back brick by brick. My plea to you is this: whether you back me in this leadership election or not, if I win, I will need you. Throughout our party's history, we've always been stronger when our members have been actively involved in our party. And I know as a team we can win. So please join the likes of Shirley Williams, Min Campbell, Jane Ashdown, William Wallace, Daisy Cooper, and 13 out of our 16 recent MEPs. Please join them and back me to be leader. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Now, Layla.
Well, thank you all for joining us, whenever time zone you may be in, morning, evening, afternoon. And thank you, Hannah, for so ably keeping us to time. Now more than ever, we need a strong liberal vision to challenge the Conservatives and move our country forward, tackling inequality through investment in early years and a universal basic income, championing a fair economy and a better recovery that supports small businesses, protects our environment, and stamps out racial discrimination in our workplaces, and bringing decision-making closer to people by radically decentralizing power from Westminster, but also recognizing that the best way of influencing abroad is to work with others. And we need to defend Britain's place in the world, not just through the strongest possible relationship with Europe, but also by investing in our soft power, our diplomatic network, the BBC and DFID, all of which are under attack by the Tories. But we also need to recognize that to change our country, we have to change our party. We have got to build our strength and push forward from the mistakes of the past. Steady as she goes just won't cut it anymore. We cannot risk dropping any lower. With the right strategy, message and leader, I know that we can do better. I know that we can rebuild our council base, become a stronger political force. And my campaigning vision of education, the environment and the economy has already gotten serious cut through. But more than anything, we need to rebuild trust again, using the resources of all of our party, no matter where you are, fighting on issues big and small, from potholes to peace and trade across the world, and fighting to revive liberalism at home and abroad. Electing me as leader sends a clear signal to voters that we have learned from our mistakes over the last decade, and that we are a party moving forward. So please, in this leadership election, vote for me and let's move forward together.
Thank you, Leila. And thank you to both our candidates for giving their time to come and speak to us all today. And you can still, you've still got plenty of time to get your votes in. The deadline is Wednesday, the 26th of August, with the result to be declared on Thursday, the 27th of August. And I hope that this event has been informative to you and has helped you decide how to cast your vote. Thank you very much for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everybody. Lovely to see you.
Bye.
Are we? Yeah. Okay.